Whenever you think of your favourite fictional heroes, I'm sure there's that one story or arc that you can point to and say with pride, that's why I love this character. Whether it's Goku fulfilling the Super Saiyan prophecy on planet Namek after the death of his best friend to the evil tyrant Frieza, or Luke Skywalker throwing his weapon aside and saving his father from a corrupt and evil emperor. They're stories that drive home the fundamental nature of these characters, who they are as people, and what they represent. But for some reason, it's taken me a shockingly long time to figure out just what story I'd point to if someone asked me what is the best Spider-Man story. I don't mean to brag, but I've been reading Spider-Man for a long time. Most of my 26 years of life, in fact. Why, I remember being a wee lad and seeing the first volume of Ultimate Spider-Man peeking out at me all the way back in 2004 at the school library. And ever since, I've read more Spider-Man than me or my mum are proud to admit. I mean, I even got the dude slapped on my arm for life. And yet if you asked me even a couple of years ago what my favourite Spider-Man story was, I'd honestly draw a blank. And it's not even because I don't have one. Far from it, in fact. See, in case you didn't know or have living arrangements similar to Patrick Starfish, Spider-Man has been around for a long time. And naturally, he has an even longer list of stories. Over 6 decades worth, in fact. So as I asked myself the big question, which Spider-Man story do I think best sums up the nature of the character? Well, let's just say it was a lengthy list to pick from. And I'll be honest, my first answer was going to be the Ultimate Spider-Man run by Brian Michael Bendis. But not only do I feel like that's kind of an obvious answer, it also just naturally wasn't the case anymore after going through a reread of some of what I consider to be Spidey's best. Alright, I'll get my top 4 out of the way before we continue. Judge me for all I'm worth. Number 4. Superior Spider-Man, because I love Doc Ock. Number 3. Kraven's Last Hunt, because, well, it's edgy, and the black suit. Number 2. Amazing Spider-Man issue 183, because come on, it's Big Will. And for number 1, folks, my favourite Spidey story, the comic that I think perfectly encapsulates Peter Parker, well, that'd have to be... Spider-Man Blue is a 6-part miniseries. Wow, I say that a lot. Written by Jeff Loeb and illustrated by Tim Sale. Jeff Loeb is a fantastic writer. One of my all-time favourites, in fact. And chances are, he's probably written some of your favourite stories as well. I mean, we're talking quite a list of bangers here. Spider-Man Blue, which we'll get to. Batman The Long Halloween. Batman Hush. Superman for All Seasons. Daredevil Yellow. Look, the man's done work. But as they say, a comic is only as good as the artist. Do they say that? I don't know, maybe they don't, but I heard it somewhere. And thankfully for Spider-Man Blue, Tim Sale knows how to, well, art. He manages to perfectly replicate that classic Spidey look, and I love how he's able to depict the era just by the way he stylizes every character. Especially Mary Jane and Aunt May. Did I say Aunt May? Yeah guys, look how stunning Aunt May looks. Especially Mary Jane and Gwen Stacy. But seriously, Aunt May, you look kinda fine. This old-timey style just works wonders for the story, since Spider-Man Blue is a complete standalone retelling of Peter and Gwen's history, and how their relationship grew and evolved. It also features all of Spidey's other iconic cast, like Mary Jane, Harry Osborn and Flash Thompson, and basically tells us how they all grew to be friends. Before a certain goblin of whom was coloured green gets involved, of course. Alright, so I'm about to give a brief summary of the story, so if you'd like to read it first, now's your chance to click away. You've been warned. So as I mentioned, Spider-Man Blue is a retelling of the events shown to us in Amazing Spider-Man, mainly covering the events before the death of Gwen Stacy. Some of you may be thinking, what's the point of retelling a story that's already been done? Well, I kinda thought the same thing before I picked the book up. However, once I finished the story, well, I began to understand why this became a thing. See, while we all love the original Amazing Spider-Man run, especially the classics, there's no denying that at the time, things happened kinda super fast between issues. Now that's obviously just the nature of comic books that are on a schedule, but a lot of the time the comics couldn't really explore Gwen Stacy that much as a character before she was killed off. I mean, let's face it, half the reason a lot of people today even like the character, or know who she is because Emma Stone killed it in the Amazing Spider-Man movies. Literally. But Gwen in the original run, well, she was never really much of a character to begin with, outside of being a love interest for Peter Parker. It wasn't until after her death that she started to get some form of personality. Now, I'm not going to say Spider-Man Blue exactly fixes that problem entirely, but I really like the changes it does bring to Gwen as a character. She's a lot less overly dramatic compared to the original 616 run, where she was a bit of a stuck-up Miss Popular sort of girl, who keeps leading Peter on only to decide she didn't want the guy a page later. She was just kind of written really inconsistently, at least in my opinion. Here she's much more compassionate and understanding towards the guy, and she's a nice contrast to the far more eccentric Mary Jane. There is also a really nice moment later in the series where Spider-Man and Dr. Connors are trying to figure out a way to destroy the Rhino suit, and thanks to science stuff that was taught to him by Gwen in class, Spidey was able to help Connors create a science thing that could destroy the suit, highlighting that Gwen was just as capable, if not more than Peter in the science department, and also shares the same love of science that Peter does, which explains their natural chemistry. But the book does use Gwen in other interesting ways outside of trying to give her some personality. She's basically there as an excuse for Peter, or the writer, to retell his time with Mary Jane, Harry and Flash, and how they matured from high school into college. I say excuse not just because of course Peter would remember all his moments with Gwen, but also because he did go out a lot just to hang out with Gwen, which naturally meant hanging out with Flash and Harry. She basically gave Peter a reason to leave his comfort zone and make some friends. All in all, I think the writing of Gwen here far outweighs her original 616 personality, and it does a solid job of conveying us pretty early on that yeah, this girl really was the love of Peter's life. So yeah, Spider-Man Blue doesn't just retell a story we've already read or are familiar with, but it builds onto it, fleshing out the parts of Peter's relationship with his sidecast that the original run just couldn't do at the time, whether for time constraints or more action, less drama mandates, or the fact that it was the 70s and Stan Lee couldn't write women. What? Did you say something? What helps is the fact that Peter is the main narrator of the book, and I know that's nothing unusual for a Spidey run, but I'm not talking about the Peter we see in the flashbacks. The narration is actually what's supposed to be an older Peter reflecting on his time with Gwen and the gang. So when we get to see these gorgeously drawn flashbacks, we get some nice extra insight into what's going on in Peter's head at the time, what he thought about his friends, lovers, villains, etc. So the story opens with Peter Parker narrating into a recording device on Valentine's Day. We can tell by Peter's words that at this point, Gwen is already gone, and the beautiful art only confirms it, showing Spider-Man swinging onto the bridge that saw the end of Gwen and placing a rose. I really adore the colouring in these pages. The idea to use blue for almost everything that isn't a flashback works perfectly to let us know just how Peter's feeling right now. Blue. I'm funny. Peter remarks in the opening pages that he's come to believe things have to get really, really bad before they can get really, really good. And that's pretty much how he's come to summarise his life. And he's not far off. Good follows bad. I love this line, it really is just a perfect way to sum up Spider-Man in the first page, and the rest of the series is pretty much focused around this whole outlook Peter has on life, with each villain being used to further drive the point home as Peter is constantly forced to decide between his social life and being Spider-Man. You know, the classic Spider-Man stuff. It's all here. Speaking of villains, I already mentioned Lizard, but there's more. All the classics are here, like Rhino, Green Goblin, Vulture, J. Jonah Jameson, and Kraven the Hunter. With it being revealed that prior to Norman's amnesia, Green Goblin hired Kraven the Hunter to kill Spidey, which actually isn't in the original Spider-Man run. So the dude basically goes around recruiting Spider-Man's villains so that once they tangle with the webhead, he can learn how to finally best Spidey. This works about as well as you'd expect for the guy. I mentioned each villain is basically used to drive the point of bad follows good or good follows bad. And the story illustrates this perfectly by having all these major villain events happen at all the moments Peter's trying to finally form a group of friends and a relationship. For example, Harry offers Peter his place so that they can be roommates, and when the dude throws a housewarming party, Spider-Man gets caught off guard by a newer, younger Vulture, when he was basically seconds away from arriving on time. So instead of joining his friends, he gets the snot beaten out of him and passes out on a rooftop covered in snow, only to get a cold the next day. Or how Peter has to pretty much throw the most pathetic excuse of his life at the two girls that are super into him because he feels guilty about not stopping a couple of vultures fighting. No, I literally mean vultures. On top of all of this, the story's packed with juicy romance, because let's be real, all a good Spider-Man story really is a soap opera romance repackaged as a superhero comic. Throughout the series, we eventually get to see the introduction of Mary Jane Watson and the love triangle that she brings, with Peter caught in the middle. I just love the way MJ is written in this story and the contrast between her and Gwen and even Peter. They're entirely different people in how they behave, but you can really see right off the bat why MJ of all people was eventually able to handle being married to this psycho. At least, I mean seriously, she's just written with such energetic fun that it doesn't take long for us to realise why Peter develops a crush on her. He's also shown to even be super supportive of his whole disappearing act, understanding that as a photographer, he has to get all the scoops. And it's not just MJ who receives some fantastic characterisation, but my man Flash Thompson as well. We start the series with Flash bullying Peter, as we've come to know, but as the story progresses, we begin to watch Flash actually grow and change. And a lot of that is thanks to Harry, MJ, and Gwen. Harry is willing to give Peter a chance and speak good in his behalf even after Peter lets everyone down thanks to Spider-Manning. Gwen constantly reassures Flash that he needs to grow up. And MJ just straight up tells the man how it is. And in the end, Flash kinda does learn to grow up, and even begins to kinda like Peter by the end of the series. And his reaction to both MJ and Gwen being into the old bookworm he used to know is hilarious. Flash even eventually gets saved by Spider-Man, and Peter even remarks that he kinda feels bad about the fact that he never told Flash who he was. After all, Flash is his biggest fan. But after being saved by Spidey, Flash has a moment of reflection in his life and decides he's not happy with how he's used his time. So he joins the army. You really get the sense that by the end of the story, these guys were genuinely good friends to Pete. Sure, Flash would lay into him any chance he could get, but at the end of the day, they cared and looked out for each other, and Peter was never afraid to give it back to old Flash either. And speaking of Peter, his characterization in this whole book is just spot on. It's seriously one of, if not the best Peter Parkers I've ever read. What can I say? He's funny, smart, witty, the dream guy. He's depicted as a real fish out of water throughout the miniseries. After all, the whole making friends thing is a pretty new concept for poor Pete. And as he mentions himself, he's still transitioning from that awkward high school phase to the cool Chad Peter phase. I also just really love the way Jeff Loeb especially writes Spider-Man. The dude seriously can't stop cracking jokes if his life depended on it, and I'm all for it. The Lizard issue in particular really highlights just how much of a stand-up guy Peter/Spidey is. See, when old Lizard pops back up, it's around the same time Dr. Connor's family have come to visit him. At this point, he's already had a few Lizard episodes, so he only sees his wife and child every so often until he can make sure he's better. Well, Spidey basically does everything he can to make sure Curt Connors is back to normal, so that the guy can have a proper relationship with his family, because that's what Spider-Man does. Spider-Man Blue is even brave enough to not wrap up on a big dramatic final fight. In fact, the focus is rarely on the action at all. Sure, there's a Spidey fight scene every issue, but it takes a backseat to the characters. And the series actually ends with one of the most beautiful set of pages I've read from a comic book, period. We get to see the Peter Parker who has been narrating for us the entire story in the attic, looking a little worn down over the years. As he finishes up his recording for Gwen, he talks about how much him and MJ have grown because of her death. And right as that happens, Mary Jane walks in to see if he's okay, and simply asks him to say hi to Gwen for her. Is someone cutting onions in here? Seriously, the ending alone is worth the whole story. It's such a mature and powerful message, and speaks volumes to who Mary Jane is as a character. No judgment or hesitation, just pure love for her struggling partner, grieving over their long-lost friend. On top of all of that, it's just a really personal, down-to-earth tale about a dude trying to make some friends and get a girlfriend. It almost feels more like a slice of life story than a superhero one, and honestly, that's when I think Spidey stories are at their best. And this story is the greatest example of that. Spider-Man Blue means the world to me, not because it reinvents the character, but because it does the exact opposite. It keeps to the very heart of this world and the characters that have been built up for over 6 decades, and uses everything we know and adore about the characters to tell a genuinely beautiful story about love, loss, and grief. And how, while it is true time does heal all wounds, the scars remain, but nonetheless we move forward. And how through that horrible pain, we're able to find and make new connections. Because pain and grief can allow us to grow and bond with one another just as much as love and joy. As Mary Jane once said, when opportunity comes knocking, you open that door, Tiger. And I just love how at the very end, we get to hear Peter's own thoughts on how the death of Gwen allowed him and Mary Jane to really connect. How they learned that life is valuable and short, and we have to make the most of it while we still can. I just hope at the very least, I've been able to somewhat illustrate why this book is truly special to me, and to a lot of other Spidey fans out there. I didn't want to do a simple retelling of the story, since if you do want to see each issue fully, I highly recommend you read this story in full for yourself. My words cannot do this book justice no matter how hard I try, and if you have a love for Spidey and his world, then you owe yourself this read. Thank you for watching. If you like this video and you want to see more content, drop a like and subscribe. And remember, true believers, take care of yourself.